I guess we can start. So today we are going to speak to the legendary game designer, American McGee. And thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, how are you living through this pandemic? How are you feeling about it?
So as you probably know, I'm based in China. I'm in Shanghai, China. And things in China are actually very normal again. I know the rest of the world is still suffering and still going through lockdowns, but things in China feel like it's just back to business as usual. And so I would say that at the beginning, we had some pretty aggressive lockdowns and people had to stay in their homes. But once that was finished, it all kind of slowly went back to normal. So we're doing quite well.
Well, great to hear it. How does it affect your work? Did it change anything?
Yeah, it's interesting actually that because our team is a virtual team. We have one person in Israel, we have one person in Australia, one person in Canada, we have people in China, we have people all over the world, people in the US, and everyone works online already. So we're a virtual team, and we use virtual team software to do all of our task management and have meetings with the teams and things like that online. So when this happened, it wasn't that big of a disruption for us because we don't go to an office anyway. Like the space that you see behind me here is my home studio. And from this space, I work with my team. We do live streaming. We also ship out products from our online shop. So some of the things that we ship out go from here. So a lot of our business is now online. So it meant that the changes were almost none, really.
Oh, well, so I guess then the new Alice is going well.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing is that it didn't slow us down. And in fact, recently we started talking with a new publisher who is interested in funding an Alice game and also interested in funding perhaps a new variation on the Wizard of Oz and helping us start a studio. And one of the things that they said is that they now understand that a development team can be virtual and that not everyone has to sit inside of the same office. And the reason they understand that is because of the pandemic and also because many of their teammates got caught outside of China and haven't been able to come back. And yet they've still been able to function and do their work. So I think that in some respects, this has actually taught a lot of people that the idea of everyone having to go to the same office to get a project done isn't necessary. And that may actually, oddly enough, it may benefit us and benefit the work that we're doing on this project.
Great to hear it. So can you describe what stage the project is at?
It's the same stage it's been at really since we started talking about it, in the sense that we're still trying to work to get a license from EA, and we're also still trying to work to secure funding so that we can develop the game. At least that's the state that it's in on the business development side. On the creative side, over the last 2 years, we've put in a tremendous amount of effort in terms of artwork, game design, narrative design, and all the other aspects of what would make up the final design for the game. That's getting to a point where we're starting to put everything into what you'd call a design Bible. So basically the entire game from start to finish, like a design document but with a lot more detail. And so we're now starting to work on putting content into the design Bible. And I imagine that in the next, I don't know if it's 6 months or 8 months, we'll have a finalized design Bible. And at that point, I'm hoping we'll also have in hand funding, and we'll have in hand everything else needed to start a new studio so that we can then start to work towards getting the game into development.
How does it feel different from when you developed the first Alice and the sequel to what you're having now on the business side, on the game development processes side, and everything?
Well, on the first game, I was actually an employee of Electronic Arts when they approached me and they said, do you want to make a new game? So that was quite different because they came to me with an offer, and then it took still some time, though. I think from the time that they said, would you like to make a game, until we got the game in development was still over 1 year. Then on the second go around, it was 2 years from the time that we started to discuss it until we got the game into development. And that was at a time where they were interested but they also wanted to do a different kind of financing structure. So it was something different than they had done before. And we also were having to put a studio in place in order to do the work. So I feel like this third time around, it's much like the second time, except that EA is probably not publishing this game. So they don't seem to be as interested in getting the license deal done quickly. I think because perhaps they think that their involvement with it isn't as great. So then they don't have as much incentive to move quickly. But things are moving forward. It's just that dealing with large corporations, even when they are willing and they really want to do something, they still move very slowly. So in this case, they're moving, I think, about the normal speed that we would expect. And my hope, again, is that soon we will have in hand the license that we need, and then we will also have in hand the financing that we'll need, and then we can get started.
Looking from the outside, I can say that I feel like also there's the difference that you now have the Patreon. Of course, you're like an indie developer now, right? So you're not inside a large corporation making this game. And also you have this Patreon where you have, I checked it yesterday, over 3,000 people backing you up. And I think that's awesome. And I think that's very different so from the back days, because you can like feel the connection with your fans and they can financially support you to make something that they wait you to make.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the best things about Patreon is the fact that the fans are involved. So we're doing something we call crowd design, which means that we get feedback from the fans on all of the design and art and everything that gets made, and we listen to that feedback. I'm starting to think this is going to be the future of game development, or it should be. Again, one of the publishers, financiers we met with recently, that was another thing I was very happy to hear from them, is that they too feel like there is a new model for game development emerging where you combine together the development of the game and the marketing of the game with the audience being involved with those things, and also with the merchandising of the game. And you open things up quite early, so like an early access type of model. So you're inviting the fans in from the very beginning, instead of, the typical situation where a game might be in development for 2 years. You might see a few screenshots here and there, but the fan involvement and the marketing really doesn't start until, say, 3 months before the game is launched. And then suddenly there's like all of this emphasis on marketing. But what the fans get at that point is something that was developed inside of a black box.
I think crowd design sounds like a great idea, but a bit on the utopic side, because when you try to source decisions from the large crowd of people, sometimes, it becomes chaos because everybody wants something different. So what are creative challenges that you come across doing this?
Well, I think one of the things, because I've also tried this in the past, and one of the things I've found is different about Patreon, for example, is that in order to have your voice heard on Patreon, you actually have to put some skin in the game. That means like you have to commit to spending $1 a month or $5 a month or maybe more. But I think that creates a barrier where you don't get trolls. Like, trolls don't mind doing troll stuff if they can do it for free, if they can just go on Twitter or go on a forum or something like that. But the moment that somebody who's a troll has to put their real name and their real credit card into a platform, it drives them away. They don't want to do that, right? So I think that one of the things about Patreon and the fact that people are paying to be at the table is that it eliminates a lot of people who would show up just to make trouble. So in the experience we've had in the last 2 years, I would say that we've not had anybody who's come to Patreon and tried to engage with this crowd design system and then done it in a way that feels like they're just there to make trouble. The other thing is that I'm honest about with our backers, we call insane children, is that it's a democratic dictatorship. There's other times I'll say to them that no matter what they tell me, I'm probably gonna make the decision on my own. And the part of them, the group of them that happen to align with or agree with my decision, then that's fine. But, we haven't had too many decisions like that to make. Now, I think that's partly because making the third game in a series like Alice means that the audience has a pretty good expectation about what the universe is about, right? It's not like you're going to get someone come to the design table and say, you know what would make this really great is dinosaurs. And so, you're not going to get ideas that are completely off the wall and don't have anything to do with the property, because the property is quite well established.
Well, speaking about Alice, as the universe, I think it's pretty unique. But at the same point, Alice, as books, it was like an inspiration for countless games, movies, and other books and everything. But I think it is such a nourishing source for people to have this idea and transform it to something else.
So I was thinking about this recently. The reason was that we had a publisher and we had one of our financial advisors say to us, when we go to seek funding, we should take Alice with us, and we should also take another idea with us, because that would actually increase the chance that a publisher or a financier might do an overall deal with us, right? So that got me thinking.
When you two options to a person, he is more likely to choose.
Yeah, but what we found in the recent conversations was that the group we're talking to now, they'd like to help us build a studio. They don't want the first project that the studio does to be a very big AAA game like Alice. They'd rather that we start with a smaller game, build the studio up, and then get to work on Alice, right? But to answer your question about why Alice, or why are people attracted to it, because we were forced to sit down and think about another project, I started looking around at all these fairy tales, and I started thinking about all the things that we might adapt. And I realized that there's a very unique thing about Alice, in that it presents a character inside of a world that we can change and manipulate and make almost anything out of that we want. So it's sort of like a place that is, from Star Trek, like a kind of holodeck, right? Whereas a lot of other universes, there's a lot of limitations on what you can show on the screen. So I think that there's something in the fact that the world of Wonderland has no boundaries. There are rules. There are certain things you wouldn't see there. You wouldn't see a spaceship there, for example. But within the realm of Alice's understandings, you can represent many, many different things, different types of creatures, different kinds of encounters. You can have magic, you can have mechanical weapons. So there's a lot of flexibility from a game perspective or a storytelling perspective about the kinds of stories you can tell there. And as I was thinking about all the other sort of well-known fairy tales that we might work with, there's a lot of limitations in those universes, or they don't lend themselves as well to this completely surreal type of art and adventure. And I think that's probably one of the things that makes Alice so interesting for creators, just from the universe perspective.
You have been making games I think for almost 30 years now, and that's hell of a time for making, for working in one industry. What keeps you inspired all these years? Do you draw inspiration from films, music, maybe other games or something?
Yeah, even though I've been inside the same industry for 30 years, my role inside the industry has changed dramatically several times, right? So when I started off, I was just a level designer, and I went from being a level designer to a creative director or game designer, and I went from doing that to being more like a producer, and then I started my own studio, and I was the head of a studio. And each time that I've made these transitions, it's meant having to acquire new skills and have to tackle new kinds of jobs. So that's one thing that's kept it from kind of feeling like I'm always doing the same thing, is because I'm always adding things to what it is that I consider my job. And then add to that the fact that, 15 years ago, I left the US and I moved to China, and I happened to arrive in China at a time that is the most dynamic, most interesting time that you could be in China. And it's perhaps the most interesting place you could be in the world ever right now. Like, not, I mean, the planet has never seen anything like what's happening in China for the last 20 years. So that's another thing that has captured my interest. And you'll see that we're doing a lot of things that reach out to and connect with games to manufacturing, for instance, like making merchandise, or things that I'm doing in the region. Like I run a game jam in Thailand called Pirate Jam, and that connects to my love of sailing, and that connects to the fact that I can travel to Thailand and set up an event there. So there's a lot that's going on for me personally about always growing and doing different jobs, but there's also a lot that's going on in China, and there's also a lot going on in this region that I moved to that just kind of keeps me engaged and always keeps me very inspired.
You've been there, I mean, in China for over 10 years already. So, and it seems like you have no plan on leaving it. How does it feel living in China as an American? Do you speak Chinese?
Yeah, so I'm married to a Chinese woman, and we just had a child a year ago. And I haven't been back to the States for I think it's been 3 years since the last time I went back. When I turn on the news these days, I don't feel like I don't feel like I really want to go back.
How does it feel for an American to live in China and to see, how the American media portrays the country you're living in?
Yeah, that's something I talk about with my friends here quite a lot, because we see the media portrayal of China. We also see the way the media portrays Russia. The US media is, I think, insane, to be honest with you. And when I see the way that people are here in China, and I've visited Russia before, I see that everywhere you go in the world, people are people. I always find it a bit ironic that the US is constantly pointing fingers at places like China and Russia and claiming that they are the ones trying to reach out and take over the world. Meanwhile, it's the US that has military bases strung all around all of these countries and has its fingers in everybody's politics and is fomenting revolutions everywhere from the Ukraine to Hong Kong to you name it, right? So as an American living outside of the US, I find looking back at the US is like looking back at a kind of ball of insanity. It's very difficult to make any sense of it, because when you have visited Russia or you've lived in China, you know what's being said on television, what you're hearing from the government of the US is completely crazy. It has no relationship to reality at all. So it's quite eye-opening, and it's one of the reasons, honestly, why after some years here, I just made the decision that this would be my home.
One last question about China. So, kind of this thing that kept boggling me for a time. We all heard the story of how you got the name. Well, at least we read it on Wikipedia, how you told it. So you had the happy mother who had a friend whose daughter was named America, and so she was inspired to name you America. But what I'm going to ask is, how does it feel for an American named American to live in China? How do you often get any weird jokes about it? Or?
So it's very funny in China. When Chinese people are born, on their birth certificate obviously is their name, and it's always in Chinese characters, right? So when we had our son, he has to have a Chinese birth certificate, and it has 3 Chinese characters. One is the family name Zhang, and then his name is Ji Ke. So he doesn't have English on his birth certificate. Chinese people get their English names because they just give themselves names. At some point in school, usually in high school, or maybe when they start university, they are asked to choose an English name. But there's no rules about what they can name themselves. So at Spicy Horse, we had an employee whose name was Led Zeppelin. We had another employee whose name was Real Alien. We had one artist who was very fast and very good, and his name in English, and you had to call him this or he would get upset. His name in English was Speed Shit. So you ask me, is American a weird name? I tell you, I used to have Led Zeppelin working for me. I wasn't the one with the weirdest name. Like, I think your question is more about like, what's it like being an American in China right now? So, what's funny is that the house we live in, the house we're in here, we rent from a Chinese guy, And he's always sending me messages on WeChat about the US-China situation. And he's very concerned about it because the news to him sounds like we're about to go to war. And his messages to me are always that he wishes I would tell people back in the US that China is the friend of the US and that we shouldn't be fighting, we should be friends. This is a very common thing that I hear. If it's taxi drivers or if it's just people that I meet, Chinese people are all very confused about why the US media is so bent on portraying them in a negative light. And Chinese people, everyone that I've ever met, they like Americans, they like America, they think that it's still this land of freedom and opportunity. And I sometimes want to tell them that actually you have a lot more freedom and you definitely have a lot more opportunity here in China than you would there in the US, but it's very hard to convince them of that. So they still believe in the American dream and they still look up to and aspire to some of the concepts that come out of America. And so I've never encountered anything negative related to my name or the fact that I'm an American here. Never.
You also talked a bit about Russia, and I know that you traveled to Russia. I think that was about like 10 years ago or so.
Yeah.
And actually I told with some guys who were around you when you traveled to Russia, and they told me some disturbingly funny stuff of your travel. So, yeah. And I won't quote them, but could you recall how the trip went, if you have some stuff to share and maybe some, some trip jokes?
I mean, it was a lot of fun. I was in Spain at the time, and I got a sudden email saying, can you go to Russia for the publisher there who was going to publish, I think it was Bad Day LA, or maybe Scrapland.
And for Russian listeners, that was Akela, I think.
Yeah, Akela, that's right. And it was just fun. I mean, everywhere we went, people were driving fast. Everywhere we went out, people were drinking hard. I mean, it was really interesting food, and I was really just amazed to walk around Red Square and see the Kremlin and see all these things that I'd only ever seen in films, and to see the subway stations were incredible. Everywhere we went, people were super nice. There was always something very interesting going on. There was a lot of freedom. I mean, that was the thing. It's like wherever we went, I just got the sense that people felt free to do whatever they wanted to do or say what they wanted to say. They weren't worried they were going to hurt someone's feelings. They weren't worried they were going to get in trouble with somebody. And I find the same thing is true here in China as well. I mean, the concept of freedom is, I think, something that's very flexible and people like to talk about. But when you go to some places and you meet people, what you find is that there's a kind of attitude and a happiness or a personal freedom that people have. And that was one of the things I noticed about Russia was just there was a kind of crazy feeling of freedom going on.
Speaking about Bad Day LA, I always love this game despite mediocre reviews and everything. I think it's kind of, what you could say, a cult game right now.
Yeah.
I think that was a bit of my guilty pleasure at the time. How did you come up with this weird idea?
Well, it's funny because that is partly what you see going on in the US these days is this racial tension and violence on the streets and this series of disaster after disaster that's taking place, right? That the news media gives you the sense that you're constantly living in fear and you should be in fear. And that was the whole tagline. And the reason that I did that was because it was linked up with 9/11 and it was linked up with the US going to these wars over in Iraq and Afghanistan that had nothing to do with whatever it was that happened on 9/11. Everything was about terror alerts and you were going to die at any moment. And I had chosen to leave the US. That was the time where I just said, I don't want to be in the US anymore. I can't deal with this anymore. So the company that paid for that game to get made, they asked me, come up with an original idea. And I tried to push them very hard to make a very simple game because that's what they were capable of doing. But they demanded a story-driven action game. So at that time, I had very strong feelings about the situation of the culture in the US. And I poured all of that into Bad Day LA. And the crazy thing is now, if you look at Bad Day LA and you compare it to what the US looks like right now, it's like I'm the Nostradamus of video games or something. It's almost like a kind of magic fortune telling for the situation in the States.
I kind of feel like speaking about the style of the game, we kind of lost the subtle art of goofy and dark games like Stabs the Zombie, Bad Day LA, and a lot of others.
Yep.
So nowadays you can't just make video games that are dark and at the same time funny. You can go with either dark and serious or light-hearted, bright and funny. And
that's right.
And do you think that a game like Bad Day LA would be possible today?
No way. I would get in so much trouble. And that's exactly what I'm saying about the concept of freedom, right? So, freedom is the ability for us to create and not worry that we're going to be canceled by somebody. Freedom is also something that goes the other way, in that you want to be able to put something you've created in front of other people, and they have the freedom to walk away or turn it off or look away, and they don't have to engage with it if it's not something that they're interested in. But we don't see that in the culture in the US these days. There's a quote by Christopher Hitchens that people have now in the US and in the UK become so bored that there's no problems in their own backyard, so they have to peek over the fence into the neighbor's backyard to see what problems there are going on over there. So this to me is really frustrating, because like you said, you want to sometimes make, like, say, a very dark humor game, but there's a whole group of people who are just waiting for you to do that so they can come and attack you and get you canceled. And I feel like something's been lost in the political correctness. There's something missing from the spectrum of the kind of stories we can tell, or the kind of art that we can present when that happens.
Speaking about Akela and Russia, have you ever played any Russian games of that time? Because we had a similar environment. I think it was like the Wild West from the creative side, so they can make really weird ideas, and perhaps there were not very polished games. Even of those time standards, but still there were some very creative ideas and something that you couldn't get on other markets.
Yeah, I can't say that I ever played that, but I'm not surprised that at some point, before, we were more free to do those kinds of things.
Yeah, I'll be sure to name you some games after we talk, so that you can check them in your free time. Well, what is your favorite game what was your favorite game to make as a process? What did you enjoy making most?
It's really a tough one to answer, because like I said, every time I've made games, my role on the game has changed somehow, right? So if you said, what was your favorite game to make as a level designer, then I would tell you, Quake was my favorite game to make as a level designer. If you said, as a game designer or creative director, then probably Alice Madness Returns, or that would have been the one that I liked the most for being a studio director, right? We had a lot of fun making Grimm at Spicy Horse as well. So probably actually Grimm was the one that was the most fun to make as somebody running a studio. And probably Alice Madness Returns was the most fun to make as a creative director, just because we had such a big team and we had a big budget and we had a lot of things that we could do that I hadn't been able to do prior to that.
Okay, then maybe probably an easier question. So what is your favorite game to have made as a result?
What you mean in terms of the final, like it's finished game?
Yeah, what did you enjoy the most playing?
Yeah, that's a tough one too, because there's a lot of variety in there. I mean, in the time that I've been making games, we've made everything from, third-person action games to multiplayer side-on shooters and dungeon crawlers and you name it, right? So in terms of just sitting down and enjoying and playing a game, I still really like the Doom and Quake games a lot. Like if I just want to blow off steam and run around and play deathmatch in something, I probably would say something like Quake, because when it comes to sitting down to relax, of all the things I've ever made, I think those were the most engaging and most fun from a kind of gameplay standpoint.
do you enjoy playing modern Doom interpretations? I mean, Doom Eternal and the previous Doom.
I tried to play the most recent Doom, Doom Eternal, and I got into that. It was really fun, but I haven't had much time for playing games recently because, like I said, we just had a baby a year ago, and I don't know if you know what babies are like, but they take a lot of time. So these days, I think the last thing that I played was Red Dead Redemption, or like one of the Hitman games I played. I can't remember, but yeah, it was over a year ago.
The thing I'm asking is because it's still made by id Software, and you are one of the people who were at the beginning of the company. Well, not the very beginning, but still. And do you think that the company was like a place that forged a lot of professionals who later went on to become prominent developers, designers, programmers, etc.? So do you think, are there any other companies that you think had a similar role?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I've even seen these maps that show the companies like, Microsoft, Bungie, Valve in the Seattle area, or, EA and NCSoft and all these companies down in Austin, or the Dallas developers, from id Software and Ion Storm and 3D Realms and all that stuff. Anyway, the map that I saw, it's like a seeding map. It shows the spread like a virus from the seeds of places like id Software, how people went and they started new things, and those things started new things, and those things started new things.
Yeah, I am asking that because, I think the scale of game development changed drastically. I mean, 20 or 30 years ago, you had like a couple of dozens, maybe, people on the team. And so that means that everybody was important in terms how they made their input into the game. They also gained a whole lot of experience, and later they went on to create something new of their own. Do you think there are such companies now that change people who enter them, forever?
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, in terms of the idea that you could go into a company and you could learn, and the teams were smaller, that's also a function of the fact that the skills that go into making the games just became much, much more specialized and in some respects more difficult. So it would be very hard to be a really good programmer and a really good animator and a really good texture artist, right? Whereas before, games were simple enough that you could be a programmer and a texture artist and maybe the sound guy. You could roll all those roles up into one. And what I see of the indie game space is that there are a lot of one-person or two-person indie teams that, still make games that can become quite successful. I mean, don't forget that Minecraft, which went on to sell for $1 billion and is arguably the most successful game ever made, was made by one person initially, right, as a sort of hobby thing. So there is a lot more resource out there. You can learn all about game development from YouTube. And if you go and download Unreal for free, you can teach yourself everything that the professional game developers know just watching those videos.
Back to your creations. So I think they all share lots of similar style, something dark, twisted humor, and there are lots of inspiration coming from fairy tales. Drawing parallels from the movies, I've always been thinking of you as of Tim Burton of games. Would you agree with that?
I mean, I've heard it 100 times, and I've never met him, but I can take it as a compliment, mostly because I like his films. I think, he's probably a more prolific and better filmmaker than I am a game maker, so I think it's I don't know that he'd want to be called the American McGee of movies. I don't know.
I think he'd be on.
I think we're on slightly different levels, but it's fine, and I can see why the comparison is made. It's probably because there are so few people making these sort of dark, twisted games with that magical fairy tale feeling, and also there's very few filmmakers who specialize in that. So the fact that we both happen to specialize in that genre in our own spaces, the comparison makes sense.
I'm asking that because, speaking of names, I always loved that you kind of turned American McGee into a brand, putting it into your titles. Could you recall how you came up with this decision first?
Well, I didn't come up with the decision. It was EA that came up with that decision. I mean, I've talked about this before, but basically when I was working on the first Alice game, and we went and found the team in Texas, Rogue, and brought them on board. And so they were developing the game, and I was providing the design input, and I would travel there to visit them and work with them on the game. We were with EA Legal, there was a kind of struggle to come up with a name because it needs to be something that can be protected as a name, can be trademarked. And one of the challenges is just like with trying to find a domain name that's open, right? Most things in that space had either already been trademarked or they were too close to existing books or films or stuff. So EA was really struggling to find something very unique that could be the trademarked name of this game. And at some point they called me up, as I think I was actually in Texas at that time. They called me up and they said, we've decided to call this American McGee's Alice. Anyway, when I told the team wasn't happy. So then I went back to the EA Legal guys and I said, look, this development team isn't happy about this. And it's fair enough, that I'm not the only person working on this. There's a bunch of people working on it. So they said, all right, we'll call you back. We'll figure it out. And so then I got a phone call saying, okay, we've decided it's not going to be called American McGee's Alice. So I immediately ran and I told the team, hey, it worked. They listened to me. They're not going to call it that. So everybody continued working on the game. And then once development was basically finished, and I think they were making the boxes or something, I got another phone call and they said, oh, we just want to let you know that we changed our minds again, and it is going to be called American McGee's Alice. And so then I had to go back to the team and say, guys, I'm sorry, but they've decided to go that direction after all. And they weren't terribly happy. But obviously for me, what followed after that has been positive, mostly positive. And I can't say that it was right for the team at that time, but it's certainly been helpful for me ever since.
So, and then why is the next Alice not called American McGee's Alice Asylum? Is it for the trademark reasons or for the reason you spoke about the team?
No, because when I have control over it, I don't put my name on the box. Other people are the ones that want to put my name on the box. If you look at all of the games that came out of Spicy Horse that were the ones that we controlled, none of them are called American McGee's anything. None of them. So when I get to make the decision by myself, I don't put my name on the box.
I think I disagree a little about it because I understand your reasons, but still I think putting the name first is very important in games nowadays because not so many people know the creators of their favorite titles. Right. And I think that's a problem in game development.
I don't know. For me, I don't mind being a bit mysterious about it. It's sort of like, Stephen King started writing under a pseudonym. Like he took on a fake name.
You said that Stephen King used, a different name, but he used it when he started. So, and obviously that's not the case with you.
No, he used a pseudonym after he was very well established. He wrote about it. He wanted to see whether or not his books and his writing would be accepted by literary agents after he became well established. Because obviously if a Stephen King novel comes out, it's going to sell a certain number of units no matter what. It's like a guarantee, right? The reason is because as a creator, you think, I don't want to be making products that people only buy because they think it's me. I'd like to know that my products also stand alone on their own sometimes.
Can you name maybe some other game creators whose names shine through their creations? I mean, of course, we had Sid Meier's Civilization, but I guess that's the only example apart from you.
Will Wright gets his name on the games, but a lot of times a Will Wright game, like if you looked at SimCity and then you looked at The Sims, other than the fact that they both have the word sim in the title, but if you set them side by side, you wouldn't necessarily know that it was the same creator because they were so radically different from one another. I don't really think about it that much. Like I said, for my part, I don't put a lot of energy into thinking about putting my name on a game. I mean, we're doing logos and stuff for a new Oz game right now, and one of our artists did up the logo, and he put American McGee Presents, but I think he just did it for the balance of the letters on the page, because that's very important to him. So everybody's got different reasons for wanting to do that. But when it comes to me, I don't know. I figure if someone else wants to push it and they want to make it happen for some reason, then that's fine. If not, then I don't really care.
I guess let's talk a little bit about what ifs. So have you ever thought how your life and career would go if you hadn't created the original Alice?
I think the better question is, how would my life and career have gone if I had not met John Carmack? Because that was my entry into the industry. And at the time where I met John Carmack, I was a high school dropout and I was working on cars. I was a car mechanic and I didn't have very good prospects. So I often wonder where I would have ended up if I hadn't met John Carmack. And I don't know that it would have been a very good place, because I'm someone who has a lot of creativity in me, but I also struggle with things like depression. And I think that without the creative outlet also happening to be my job, I might have struggled a lot more with things that are related to that, substance abuse or, sort of psychological or emotional problems. And I say that because I have people in my family that are also struggling with those kind of things, because a lot of times those are hereditary, but they're not necessarily in a similar position like me where they have a professional way to have a creative outlet. And the result is that they're not very happy, or in some cases they are struggling with abuse, or even worse, in the case of my sister, she vanished and she's presumed dead. So I think that for me, it illustrates the possible path I might have gone down if I wasn't as fortunate as I was to meet John Carmack. I think that he saved my life, and it's quite just simple. He just saved my life.
Okay, so I think that as we are coming to the end of our interview, I think that's the best time to say how our listeners can help you make Alice Asylum, to cite all the places they can sign up, where you can back you up, and where they can follow updates.
Sure. Well, it's very simple. So like you said about my name on the box, I do have a website called AmericanMcGee.com. And if you go to AmericanMcGee.com, there's actually a list. We made it very simple. You sign up for a mailing list, or you can join us on Patreon, or you can follow me on places like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, or you can go to the online retail shop that I run with my wife. All of those things help support us, and it's a very easy list. You just follow from the top to the bottom, and you choose which thing that you want to do, or maybe you do all of those things.
Yeah, better do all of those things. Yeah, well, thanks for joining us today. That was quite fun to hear your thoughts on your career and other games and everything. Well, for me, it was like, the most interesting talk I think we've had in months. So thank you for joining us.
I've seen your interviews. You've got some very cool people on, but I really appreciate you having me. And it was a lot of fun. So, and hello to all of the Russian fans. Very happy to know that you're all out there.
Yeah, and hello to the guys from A Killer of the Time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for joining us, and well, goodbye to all.
All right, bye-bye.